Would you pray with me? God, who travels with us always, be with us here and now, and be in our words and be in our thoughts and be in our spirits. Amen. Sometimes I play this little game with myself when I'm bored or when I'm letting my mind wander, or maybe when I'm on a run and I'm kind of daydreaming through the miles. Sometimes I pretend that I'm giving tours to people from the past. Sometimes I pretend that somebody from the past has hopped into a time machine and ended up here and now, and that for some reason everybody picked me to explain stuff to the time traveler. So in my head, I explain electric cars to Henry Ford. I explain Victor Wembanyama to James Naismith. Sometimes I think about what it would be like to try to get Thomas Jefferson up to speed on multiracial democracy, or to tell George Washington about unmanned drones, or to show some 15th century poet what the far side of the moon looks like. I don't know why I do it, but it's a pattern that my brain has, and it's gotten me through some tedious waits at the DMV and those hours lying awake in the middle of the night and the doldrums of long drives across the plains. I was thinking about that as I was thinking about Easter. I was thinking about how we think about Easter, and how our way of thinking about Easter would not necessarily make a ton of sense to somebody like Mary Magdalene if she were to step out of a time machine. Or if the person who wrote the Gospel of John, if the person who wrote those words that our own John Pfeiffer just read for us, if that person showed up here today, I'm not sure how easy it would be to explain ourselves. And then, of course, if Jesus himself were to arrive here at this moment in a time machine, I imagine he would have a lot of questions about the ways we celebrate his death and resurrection. Can you imagine explaining it? Yes, we do a lot with eggs. And of course, there are bunnies, lots and lots of bunnies, and just wait until you hear about what we do on your birthday. I think it would be hard to explain things like Easter egg hunts and chocolate rabbits to anyone who arrived here from the first century, but I think it would also be just as difficult to explain the theology of Easter. I think it would be hard to explain our meanings of Easter to Peter and Mary Magdalene and the disciple whom Jesus loved. Maybe it would be harder to explain that to them than it would be to tell Galileo about that Artemis mission that's going to be looping around the moon tomorrow. And that's because today, for many Christians, if not most Christians today, Easter and the resurrection of Jesus have turned into a test of faith. The resurrection has turned into a test of faith in Christianity, where if you believe that Jesus was physically raised in bodily form, then you're a good Christian, and if you don't believe it, then you're not. Or, on the other hand, the resurrection has turned into a test of faith in science. So if you believe Jesus was raised from the dead, you are a superstitious rube, and if you don't believe it, you are a good 21st century rationalist. I don't think any of that would have made much sense to the followers of Jesus gathered at the empty garden tomb on that first Easter morning. Today, on our side of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and today in our scientific worldview, the resurrection has turned into one of those Rorschach tests that says a lot about how you see the whole world. The resurrection has become a believe it or not litmus test that decides whether you're truly faithful or truly educated or truly whatever it is that somebody else thinks we all ought to be. And that would not have made any sense to the earliest Christians. It wouldn't have made sense on that first Easter morning that Jesus' death and resurrection might become some kind of final exam that we either pass or we fail. Because on that first Easter morning, resurrection was not an intellectual proposition. Resurrection was not an abstraction to be tussled over. Resurrection on that first Easter was not even a claim about faith to submit to or reject. No, on that first Easter morning, standing there beside that empty tomb, the resurrection was an act of defiance. If you were here last Sunday, if you were here on Palm Sunday, then you heard about how the moment we know of as Palm Sunday was a political moment. We think of Palm Sunday today as a religious moment, but last week we talked about how Palm Sunday was a political moment, how it was a parade fit for a king, how it was a procession patterned on the processions of Israel's kings as they prepared to take their place on the throne. And we talked about how on Palm Sunday, Jesus was acting out the script for being the Messiah, for becoming the King of Israel, a script that placed him right into the crosshairs of the Roman Empire. On Palm Sunday, Jesus' life became political because his actions put him into competition with Pontius Pilate and with the emperor in Rome and with the whole grinding machinery of empire that would tolerate no rivals. Jesus' life became political on Palm Sunday if it hadn't been already. And then, on the day we call Good Friday, on the day he was executed by the Roman state as an enemy of the state, on that day, Jesus' death became political too. You don't end up in a Roman courtroom by just being an itinerant faith healer and preacher. You don't end up on a Roman cross by just sticking to religion. Jesus' death was political because Jesus' life was political because all life is political somewhere down the line. And nobody knows better than empire that the only effective way to squash a life of political hope is death. The most effective way to stop a hopeful movement is violence. So they arrested Jesus, they hauled him in front of the representatives of empire, they interrogated him and they mocked him for his hope. And then in the end, they did the only thing empires really know how to do, which is to inflict violence and pain and death until there is no hopeful spirit left to imagine any source of life and truth, apart from the state that claims all souls. I say all that to remind us that when Mary Magdalene arrived at the tomb that first Easter morning, when Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved raced each other to that place on the strength of Mary's testimony, they were living in the deep shadow of violence. They were moving in the familiar territory of empire's violence. They were standing in the presence of a death they knew all too well. Mary and Peter and the other disciple, they belonged to a conquered people. They knew very well the rituals of humiliation and death brought and inflicted by their occupiers, and they arrived that morning steeped in the expectations of empire's victory. They arrived that morning in sorrow. They arrived that day in defeat. They raced to the graveside that sunrise hour, anticipating that familiar smell of death, but they found instead defiance. They found there in the tomb a reversal. They discovered that all their assumptions about the way of things had been mistaken and incomplete. They discovered that death had not yet had the final word. They discovered that empire had not had the final say. They discovered the defiant persistence of life. And it was not only life, though that would have been enough. It was not only life that had defied death, but it was that hope had defied an empire's claim on all of them, and that the worst that the despots and the governors and the soldiers could do had not been enough to turn out the lights on the life and the beauty that they had long since given themselves over to. So it was defiance that they found in that empty tomb on that first Easter morning. It was defiance that greeted Mary as she stood shaking in fear. It was defiance that met Peter and the other disciple as they stood breathless from running to the place. It was defiance that found Mary as she heard two angels ask her why she would be weeping, and as she realized that the one she was talking to was not a gardener, but it was Jesus. It was defiance that Mary found in Jesus as he told her that the empire had done its worst and that the empire's worst had not been enough to keep him down. I don't think that in that moment it would have made any sense to Mary to ask whether a bodily resurrection might violate the laws of nature or the principles of science. I don't think it would have made any sense to Mary in that moment either to insist that believing in the bodily resurrection was essential to her faith, because in that moment, Mary probably did not know what to believe. The first response to resurrection was uncertainty. The first response to Easter was not knowing, if you look back at verse 2. And it is therefore theologically appropriate for us not to know either. I think if Mary hopped out of a time machine in any given Christian church on an Easter Sunday, she might be confused by all the certainty. In that moment, by the tomb, when Mary called out to Jesus and moved toward him to embrace him, she was acting not out of any theological certainty or scientific satisfaction, but Mary was acting out of the sheer joy that came from realizing that despite the worst efforts of a violent and bloody empire to kill him, Jesus was alive. Jesus was defiantly alive, and Mary called his name and reached out to embrace him in an act of defiance. We live in an age of violent and bloody empire. You can take your pick of which empires I mean. If you think I'm preaching against the nations or the politicians you hate, I probably am. But I'm probably also preaching against the ones you voted for too. I'm probably preaching against the empires you support as well, and the politicians I support and the empires I'm a part of, because we live in a time of many powerful and violent and bloody empires. We live amongst empires that deploy armies and empires that deploy algorithms to deny healthcare claims. We live amongst empires that drop bombs and empires that raise interest rates to squeeze the people of developing nations. We live amongst empires that commit war crimes and empires that commit economic exploitation and empires that commit nothing to the well-being of their own people. And just like Jesus and just like Mary and Peter and the other disciples, we live in the shadow of a violence that consumes the world we know. Perhaps anyone who hopped out of a time machine here and now would recognize that about our world. Perhaps such is the way of things in all times and places. And if that is the way things are, if we do share that in common with Jesus and Mary and Peter and all the others, if we do live in the shadow of power that seeks to snuff out hope and inflict pain until it gets submission, if all that is true, then the thing to learn from the resurrection is that the only response to death-mongering is defiance. The only response to violence is defiant peace. The only response to exploitation is defiant solidarity. The only response to division is defiant unity. The only response to hatred is defiant love. The only response to death is defiant life. The only response to an empire's cross and an empire's crucifixion on a dark afternoon is a defiant and joyful Easter morning. That's why we gather in a place like this, to make a witness of our defiance, of every death-dealing empire, to make a show of defiance against every force of violence and every kind of division, to be defiantly on the side of peace and unity and the love that Jesus came preaching, and to stand defiantly on the side of life and flourishing for all God's people. This is the meaning of resurrection, and this is the joy of an Easter day, and so we proclaim it defiantly. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. May it be so.